Hi, I'm Emily from the Economics Tutoring Center, and today we're going to do some problems on calculating GDP. Just so you know, different teachers use different notation, so be sure to check with your professor before you use or implement any of these exact methods. Continuing on with our discussion of GDP and how to calculate it, we're going to move to this question. It's a little bit of a long question, so we're going to break it down into parts. But the idea behind this question, what is the GDP in this small economy, is asking us to calculate GDP. So our GDP equation, GDP equals C for consumption, plus I for investment, plus G for government spending, plus net exports, so X net. All right, and another important thing to note before we start this question is that our GDP is only about the production of new goods and services in this country in a given year. So that's going to come up as we approach a few of these scenarios. So Ryan buys wood from Aaron for $50. I'm going to label that as 1. Then uses the wood to build 3 tables, each of which has a market value of $80. Mike and David each buy one of these tables, while 1 table remains in the store to be sold later. So this idea that uses the wood and then sells or stores the tables is going to be scenario 2. For our third scenario, we're going to consider this next little portion. After 2 months, Mike decides that he does not like the table anymore and asks his grandmother if she wants to buy it for $60. His grandmother just received a check from Social Security, and so she decides to buy the table from her grandson. So this buying the table, which was for $60 from the information above, I'm going to label as 3. And receiving the check for $300, I'm going to label as scenario 4. Moving on, however, the table does not quite fit the color scheme of her house, so she has it stripped and stained for $50 by a local furniture store. So this last transaction of the problem, she has it stripped and stained for $50. I'm going to label scenario 5. So we have 5 different exchanges happening here. 1 with the buying of wood, 2 with the making of tables and selling of tables, 3 with the buying of the table when Mike's grandmother buys it, 4 when Mike's grandmother receives her Social Security check, and 5 when the table is sent away to be stripped and stained. So based on the information we have here, and the reason I previously wrote down this equation for GDP is because we need to be careful when picking which kind of GDP method we're going to use for calculation. Which way makes more sense given the amount of information we were given? All right, so based on the information we've been given here with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we're going to go ahead and use the expenditure approach because we've been given information about consumption and about inventory and about different transactions that are occurring in between. So let's go ahead and start. In scenario 1, Ryan buys wood from Aaron for $50. But in scenario 2, these tables are created to reach their final market value of $80. So how do we use both of these situations? Well, in scenario 1, Ryan does consume that $50. However, this ends up being an intermediate good because he uses that $50 of wood to create 3 tables. All right, so we're going to be looking at 2 for that final consumption value that we're going to be adding in. And again, that's because $50, that he spent on wood is an intermediate good, and we don't include that because the $50 is already in, or we already count that in the costs of the final table value. So when Mike and David buy one of the tables, so they each buy a table, that's $80 times 2, we increase our consumption by that value. So when Mike and David buy the tables, we increase our GDP by 160 in the value of consumption. And then additionally, one table remains in the store to be sold later. And this idea that the table is remaining in the store is part of our gross investment, because investment includes all unsold inventory. So that one table, what was that one table worth? It was worth $80. So we're increasing our investment by $80 because this table is worth $80 and it's unsold inventory. So no one bought it. We can't consider it consumption, but it's still in our GDP because it was produced in this year. So in total, we've added 160 and 80. Now we're going to move to scenario 3, where Mike's grandmother decides to buy the table from him. I'm going to go back to scenario 1 and just make a little dash mark so we can remember that we didn't add anything there. Okay, so in scenario 3, Mike's grandmother buys the table back from Mike. So what's happening here? Yes, there is a transaction. The grandmother is buying the table from Mike. And so normally we would think that this might be part of consumption because she's consuming this good. She's buying it from her grandson. However, we only count the new goods and services in our GDP. And so because Mike had already bought the table, we counted that in scenario 2. And so we don't need to count this resale of the table in scenario 3. So there's nothing is being added to GDP in scenario 3. All right, scenario 4, where the grandmother receives a Social Security check in the mail of $300. We would think that since Social Security comes from the government, that maybe we're increasing our GDP by 300. However, GDP, again, only counts the production of new goods and services in a given year. We are not exchanging a good or service. We're merely transferring a payment from the government to an individual in that country. And so here, also nothing is happening because no good or service is being exchanged. And finally, in situation 5, the table is stripped and stained for $50 by a local furniture repair store. So now that grandmother has the table, she decides that she wants to do something different for it. So she takes the table and she goes to another company, the furniture repair store, and asks them or pays them for a service where the table is stripped and stained for $50. So here, we're actually going to get an increase in consumption by $50 because grandmother is paying for a service. And this is a new service. Now, we didn't count when grandmother bought the table because, remember again, it wasn't a new good or service because Mike had already bought the table. She was merely buying it secondhand. However, when she strips and stains the table, this is a new service. So that was all of our scenarios, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to go ahead and add that together to find out what the GDP was. So our consumption here, it increased by 160 when we sold the tables and by 50 with the service. So we have 160 plus 50 equals 210, which equals the consumption. And then we also had this addition of $80 to investment. So 80 equals I. And in this small economy, we did not have any government expenditures on final and new goods and services, and we did not have any net exports. So when we add all of these together, we just get 210 plus 80 for a total GDP of $290 in this economy. And that's all for today. If you need any more help, feel free to come to the Economics Tutoring Center on the second floor of the BA building. I hope this was very helpful. Bye.
That's good.